Good afternoon. Andy, thank you for that. It's not very often that an introduction makes me somehow or other have really extra thoughts, but I have enjoyed our phone relationship and certainly have enjoyed getting to be here. I heard a lot of good things about Andy from other places before I came, about the kind of work that he does and how folks are very confident about the future of the school as long as he is a part of it, along with the other good members of this faculty. It is a privilege to get to come and be with you today and again, and to get to be a part of what is a very, very important study. The book of 1 Corinthians, as you already know, is literally filled with the imperfections of the church, a church that struggled in many ways. And yet, interestingly enough, it's still described as the church of God in Corinth. It is worthy of discussion, worthy of correction. The Apostle Paul gives it much of that, but still has a great hope, a great confidence in them and in the Lord who bought the church. The 7th chapter of 1 Corinthians is a powerful chapter, and one that really in many ways hinges on the title expression that we're using today, in view of the present distress. I think that the directives of this chapter in large measure arise out of that current distress that they were undergoing. And that's not to say there's nothing else within the text at all that is to be considered, but many of Paul's answers seem to arise because of the present distress. Before we get into the actual study that we're going to be involved in, I think it's important for us to note the power of questions. The older I get, the more that I strive to make less statements in individual Bible studies and ask more questions. The reason for that is because oftentimes I assume that I know where the other person is coming from. The reality is I do not. And that gives rise to many problems. And so I've learned to ask more questions. I've been stunned at some of the answers, and on occasions have learned something that was very, very valuable that I never would have found if I hadn't have let the other person tell me what they thought about a particular passage. The Apostle Paul, of course, used questions in order to lead people into a fuller understanding of the will of God. But in this chapter and in some of the succeeding chapters, you'll discover that the Apostle Paul is responding to their questions, that they've been asking him about the Christian life. And it comes, it seems to me, out of an interesting background. But let us go into the text, beginning at verse 17, and observe that background. That this involves the Christian and social relations. Notice verse 17. But as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. When J.W. Shepherd looked at this passage, he said Paul endeavored to convince his readers that their relation to Christ was comparable with any social relation or position, not sinful in itself. Their conversion to Christ involved, therefore, no necessity of breaking asunder their social ties. Now, what is Shepherd talking about? Why would he go there? It's very simple. When you become a Christian, you begin a new life. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, for example, the Apostle Paul says, therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new. Similarly, in the book of Colossians chapter 3, beginning at verse 1, the apostle writes to the brethren of Colossae, and to them he says, if then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience, in which you yourselves once walked when you lived in them. That's a pretty significant statement that Paul is delivering there. It's an expansion in some ways of what he told the brethren at Rome in Romans chapter 6, when he says that we are buried with Christ by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Romans chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. Notice the idea, walk in newness of life. Brethren, we need to emphasize more than we do, I think, the concept of being born again. What happens around your house when there is a new life? How does that take place? Well, the only way it took place around our house was there had to be a birth of some sort in order to have a new life around the house. Well, the Apostle Paul talks about walking in newness of life, Romans 6, verses 3 and 4, which is a clear reference back to the Lord's statements to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, where he says, you must be born again. You must be born anew. And of course, Nicodemus didn't understand that. And he asked the question that I suppose anybody would have asked. He said, can a man enter a second time into his mother's womb? When I was born, I weighed about 7 ounces, 7 pounds, excuse me. And let's go a little bit further than ounces. 7 pounds, and now I weigh 100 and none of your business pounds. My mother, were she still living, I'm sure would be terrified to hear somebody say, he's got to be born again, if you were talking about the physical. But that's all Nicodemus knew. And so the Lord went on to explain, you must be born of water and of the Spirit. Under the direction of the Spirit, you will be born in water. And therein comes a great transformation from spiritual death to spiritual life. You hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. So recognizing that and knowing that the Corinthian brethren would have understood that background and would have had all that taught to them in some form or fashion, then they come to a series of questions that are logical, it seems to me. And that is, well, if I've got an all-new life, does that mean I give up all my social relationships? Do I cease to be a slave if I'm a slave? Do I need to give up circumcision if I was circumcised? Do I need to become circumcised if I was not circumcised? And on the questions seem to just pour out. The apostle in verse 17 makes it plain that no, becoming a Christian, becoming a part of Christ, does not change all social relationships, but instead we can remain in them as long as they're not unlawful. And that's the critical matter in this passage. So he goes ahead in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 18 and 19, and he says, was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. And so he begins to illustrate the point of social relations and not being impacted as long as they're not sinful in and of themselves. The point of that is made more clear by looking at a real situation. Now, in this era, oddly enough, there were those who converted from being Jews to being Christians. who were ashamed of their circumcision. And so they seek to have the mark of their circumcision in some way obscured. Now, I don't really even understand how they did that, and I'm not sure I want to know, to be honest about it. But what I'm saying is they wanted to hide that because they'd changed. They're Christians now. Paul says, you don't need to do that. You don't need to go down that road. On the other hand, the Judaizing teachers had explained to the Gentiles, incorrectly so, that they must be circumcised. In fact, James in Acts chapter 15 says, to whom we gave no authority. We didn't tell them to do that. They're speaking where they're not allowed to speak. We have been very specific, and they are ignoring the specificity of that, and the silence, which would be in that case prohibitive. It would prohibit them from doing anything else but what the apostles had said. What do you have to do to be saved? Believe and be baptized, the Lord said. Mark chapter 16 and verse 16. Now, the apostles, along with James and the elders in the church at Jerusalem, say, we've been very specific about what's required, and our silence in regard to the matter of circumcision means that you have no authority to speak. And that's very important. That is a matter that we ought to understand so that we can better understand how to ascertain biblical authority. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, Paul says, for in Christ neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, but faith working through love. So in the first instance, it's clear that Paul is saying, don't change your social relations. If you were a Jew when you became a Christian, it's all right to remain circumcised. If you were a Gentile when you became a Christian, it's all right to remain uncircumcised. Those things don't have to change. But then he goes to a second illustration. This is the illustration of slavery, verses 20 and 21. Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be free, rather use it. Now, this is a tremendous statement that Paul is making here. He's saying your physical relationships, social relationships, in regard to, we're going to say work, because we're not really enslaved in the way that they were. But our relationships in regard to work do not change because we become a Christian. If I had a Christian boss when I became a Christian, it wouldn't mean that now I'm his equal and he can't tell me what to do. That won't work. You're called in that situation, remain there. That's what the Apostle Paul is saying. Now, of course, we've been freed in Christ, no doubt about that. And he goes on to explain that in the very next verse, verse 22, when he says, for he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman, while he who is called while free is Christ's slave. It's important to realize that we are freed to serve. Look, for example, at Romans chapter 6, where in verse 22, the apostle says, but now having been set free from sin and having become slaves of God, you have your fruit to holiness and the end, everlasting life. We're freed to serve. The reality is that everybody, in point of fact, who is in Christ is serving as a slave, but not a physical slave. We become the slave, a spiritual slave of the Lord. And Paul had already pointed that out in Romans chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. So you're freed, but you're freed to serve. Didn't Jesus demonstrate that in John chapter 13? When in verses 1 through 17, he himself became the slave that took care of the feet. You see, in the feasts of that day, it was common when you entered the room where the feast was prepared that three things would be present: a basin with water, a towel, and a slave. Well, they entered that upper room, and guess what? There was a basin of water there. There was a towel there. But if you had have looked around, being one of the 12, you'd have said, no slave. Jesus took the role of the slave. He took off his outer garment. Instead, he tied the towel around his waist, perhaps. And then he went from man to man, washing their feet. And having done so, he explained to them, what I've done to you, you in turn ought to do to each other. We ought to serve one another. We are freed to serve. But then comes what might be described as an irony. That is, free men who become Christians become, in fact, slaves. Slaves of Christ. Now, Paul was looking at both sides of this, and for good reason. In Acts chapter 20, for example, verse 28, when Paul called for the elders to come from Ephesus to Miletus to speak to them for what he thought would be the last time, you may remember a part of what he said. Take heed, therefore, to yourselves and to all the flock of which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he hath purchased with his own blood. He bought us with his blood. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, the apostle Peter says, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, such as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. I like the first verse. I'll be honest about it. That verse 18. Where he said, you're not redeemed with corruptible things like silver and gold. Well, in my case, I say I am very thankful for that, because I wouldn't have enough silver and gold to buy my way out of anything. In fact, my mortgage company would say, no, you don't. You just take care of business with us. That's all. That's what we want you to do. Say, I don't have the silver and gold to buy my way out. Truth is, if Mr. Gates were here today, he wouldn't have enough either, because silver and gold won't do it. It won't achieve it. But in place of that, we are bought with the precious blood of Christ. And that word precious is an interesting word. It literally carries the idea of priceless. And here's how that could be illustrated. And by the way, if you're willing to do this, I'd be more than happy to follow through on my end of the bargain. If you'll look before you leave the auditorium after this lesson, look at your pocket change. I'm just looking for a penny. I mean, that's it. A 1909 SVBD. If you have one, I will give you $10 for it. But let me tell you in advance, they're selling for over $1,000. Now you say, why would a penny sell for over $1,000? Well, there's a good reason. Because there were never very many minted in the first place. And now there are very, very few examples that are extant that we know of. And so the rarity of the coin makes it more valuable. Now watch this. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, the only one of his kind. There's not another like him. So Peter says the church and individual Christians were purchased with the priceless Son of God's blood. The only one of a kind. All right, so what have we learned? We have learned in reference to their social relations that the Apostle Paul says basically, as long as it wasn't sinful in the first place, just stay where you are. It's all right. He used two clear illustrations of that. One having to do with the concept of circumcision, and the other having to do with the concept of slavery. But now, he begins to answer their next question. When McGarvey looked at this chapter, he said that the next question was, is virginity preferable to marriage? And the answer begins in verse 25 of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, when the apostle goes on to say, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment from the Lord, yet I give judgment as one whom the Lord in his mercy has made trustworthy. It's an interesting expression. First of all, observe that the word translated trustworthy is in the present tense. Therefore, the idea is that he had been, he was at that time, and he would continue to be in the future worthy of their trust. He is giving a judgment then that is based on the fact that he is one you can trust in the Lord. The Lord said that, and you can believe it. You can rely upon what he has said. Now, interestingly enough, before we go any further, I want us to remember that Paul ordinarily commends marriage. You look at Ephesians chapter 5, he actually uses marriage as a tremendous demonstration of the relationship between Christ and the church. Now, I find it odd. We've now flipped that totally the other way, haven't we? See, now we actually in the Lord's church better understand the relationship of Christ to the church than we do of the husband to the wife. So we flipped it. But in their generation, in that first century setting, the Ephesian Christians understood, to some extent at least, the relationship of husband to wife, but they didn't understand the relationship of Christ to the church. So Paul seizes on that relationship, in no wise condemning it, but instead commending it, as it were, as something that is good, and then giving directions for how that ought to be carried out. Similarly, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, he describes how that the man who would be a bishop must be the husband of one wife. In Titus chapter 2, verses 3 through 5, he talks specifically to the older women and urges them to teach the younger women to love their husbands and to love their children. So Paul ordinarily is one who commends marriage. And I want us to understand that before we delve into this, because the situation here is different. Notice verses 26 and 27. I suppose, therefore, that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Because of the present distress. I already told you that in many ways, I think the entire chapter hinges on this. Why else? Early in the chapter would Paul indicate to the single man and the single woman that it would be best if they could remain like he was, unmarried. Why would he do that? Well, because of the stress or the distress that they were under. Now, last night, if you were here, we dealt with 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 that talked about the persecution, the tribulation that they were under. And brethren, let us realize that tribulation is not something that is coming, it's something that has already come. Now, I'm not saying because of that it'll never come again. Don't misunderstand me. What I am saying is that it's not a future tense idea that is only going to happen in a 7-year period while the Lord is with the saints up in heaven rejoicing. That's not adequate in the scriptural context. It will not fit. The reality is they were already under pressure. They were already being squeezed out like you squeeze the juice out of a grape. And those are the words that Paul used in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. It is that kind of distress that causes Paul to say, if you're not married, if you're not bound to a wife, don't seek to have one. If you are bound to a wife, don't seek to be loosed. So in going back to the original idea, social relations, are social relations changed when one becomes a Christian? In other words, do I give up my marriage? I'm a new creature. So my wife was married to that old guy. She's not married to this guy. Is that the case? No, Paul says. That's not the case at all. It has not changed, and we need to recognize that. Verse 28 then, he goes on to say, but even if you do marry, you've not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. Trouble in the flesh. Why? Well, Terry Varner was here yesterday. There are other brethren here that know about what happened to me this spring. For the first time in my entire preaching career, I had to call the folks at New Union and say, I will not be able to come. My wife is sick. She has MS, and she was enduring a really intense problem at that time, and we could not get it resolved so that I could leave home, and I called and said, I cannot come. Now, were I a single man, that would not have been an issue, would it? Would not have been any concern whatsoever. But as a married man, I naturally have concerns for my wife. And in that case, I don't believe those concerns are unfounded in a godly sense of the word. I think they're appropriate. I'm to take care of my wife. I'm to love her like I love my own flesh. You know, I wouldn't leave my body behind and go preach. That wouldn't happen, would it? All right, well, then you wouldn't leave your wife behind. But you can see that Paul is talking about something along that order when he's talking about these matters. So, what about marriage? Is virginity preferable to marriage? And the answer is, well, under the current situation, it very well might be. Now, in the book, you have my point that I think Paul goes off on a diversion. The guy that wrote that is crazy, and you ought to ignore it. I think that as I've studied this in more depth, that I have a different view of it that I think is more likely correct. And here's how I come to that. If someone had told me when I was single that it would be better that I not marry, I might have said, man, that's really taking something away from me for quite some time. And the Apostle Paul responds to that with an interesting discussion on the brevity of life. This situation, even if it were to last for the remainder of your life, so that you could not get married, even if that were the case, don't worry about it because life is not that long anyway. Look at verses 29 through 31. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep, as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice, as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy, as though they did not possess. And those who use this world, as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away. And there is the reality that he wants us to see. All of us are familiar with James' statement, James chapter 4, when he describes life as a vapor, a mist. You know, in these mountains, and certainly in central Mississippi, where we now live, on occasions you get up in the early morning and you look out the window and it looks like to get to the car you're going to need an axe to cut through the fog. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? And it looks like it'll be there forever, doesn't it? I mean, it really does. And if you start driving in it, just creeping along, you think, wow, what are we going to do? But then along about, 10 o'clock, maybe as late as 11, but sometime when the sun gets well up in the sky, all of that is burned off, and it's as if it never existed. You know, this life, when you're young, looks like it's as permanent and thick as a morning fog. But the reality is that as you get older, in a certain sense, the sun gets up in your life, and all of a sudden, it doesn't look nearly as long. It's a very, very brief thing. In Job chapter 7, verses 6 and 7, Job writes in the midst of his anguish, and he says, my days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and are spent without hope. Oh, remember that my life is a breath. My eye will never again see good. Hear Job. Hear what he says. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. As a middle-aged preacher in Cookeville, Tennessee, I remember sitting down one day at the funeral home with a 96-year-old woman whose sister had just died. as I sat talking to her, she made some interesting comments. She started to talk about some things that she did in high school, she and her sister. And then she said, "It seems like yesterday." And that's it, isn't it? That's how fast life goes by. It seems like only yesterday. Here she was, 80 years removed from what she was talking about, and yet it seems like only yesterday. No wonder then that Moses could take the position that he did. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 25, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. I think later translations have the passing pleasures of sin. The reality is, and by the way, let's stop and doing some of what we do. Don't tell young people that sin isn't fun. That's a lie. It is fun, but it's only fun for a very brief period of time. It's very, very short. And Moses gave up the fun, if you would, of sin so that he could suffer with God's people and enjoy something far better. And that's what we need to be setting forth plainly to them, because that's the reality. So, Paul pauses to talk about the brevity of life, but now I believe because he wants them to understand that even if you can't have or choose not to marry for the rest of your life, it's okay. Life's not that long anyway. It's not going to last. Then he goes to his personal instructions, inspired, trustworthy instructions that he gives in regard to marriage. Notice verses 32 through 35. But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. Well, we've already discussed this somewhat, but Paul now begins to explain that there is a rationale behind what he is saying. And interestingly enough, he uses a word that the Lord himself uses. The word is found in Luke chapter 10, verses 41 and 42. You may remember that Jesus is in the house of Mary and Martha, that Martha is very, very busy. She's getting the meal ready. She's preparing the table, whatever all went into that. She's just busy and burdened with all those various things. And Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening as the Master teaches. You may also recall that Martha came to the Lord and basically said, "Would you please tell my sister to help me? You see, I've got a lot of responsibility here. Get her over here and let's get on with it." Listen to the Lord's answer, Luke 10, 41 and 42. "Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part which will not be taken away from her." You are worried. When Linsky looked at that word, worried, he said literally it could be translated divided. She had many different things calling for her attention. Have you ever been in that situation? I think the older I get, the more I appreciate when I heard somebody say that as you get older, you think more and more about the hereafter. You know, I get into a room and I ask myself, what am I here after? You know, I understand that. There are so many different things going on, seemingly all at once. You know, got a lesson to prepare, got a manuscript to write, got an article to write. I've got to get ready for this meeting that's coming up, and so now I go to do something, and I can't remember what I went to do because I've got too many things to do. That was Martha. Martha was divided in her attention. And that division caused her to be drawn away from the important thing. And the important thing was hearing and following the Lord. Now that is exactly what Paul's talking about here. He's saying the reason that I'm recommending, that I'm giving you the inspired advice that you not get married under the present circumstances is that when you get married, you're naturally going to have to pay attention to your spouse. And if you're not married, then you can give all of your attention to the Lord. Now, I should pause long enough to say I do not believe that this at all suggests that Paul was saying you should never marry. That's not the case. This is all in view of the present distress. And if you ever remove it from that context, then you're going to end up somewhere that I don't think that the Lord nor the Apostle Paul intended for us to go. That is not what he's talking about in this case. So then finally, he deals with the giving of a daughter in marriage. Notice verse 36 as we read on in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. But if any man thinks he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of youth, and thus it must be, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let them marry. Now, for us, this is a difficult passage to understand. We don't have situations like this anymore. Now, I know last night, Gene described how that his future son-in-law came to the house, and apparently he asked for her hand in marriage. Although Gene was a little bit confused about who actually asked, but at any rate, he asked for her hand in marriage. But that was not because he was obligated to do that. Instead, it was a matter of respect that brought him to do that. We're not required. There are those who actually say, let's get married, and off they go, and they get married. And there's nothing legally wrong with that. A little bit disrespectful, seems to me, but still nothing legally that's wrong with it. But in that era, as Lipscomb very well points out, it was the case that the father of the house decided how and when his daughters would be married, or even if they'd be married. It was all up to him. They had no voice in it. If he said, you're not getting married, they didn't get married. If he said, you are getting married, then they got married. That's the way it was. So now Paul is turning specifically to fathers who might have virgin daughters who wanted to marry. And Paul indicates to them, don't let it trouble you. If she has desires that can only be fulfilled in marriage, then let her marry. If not, and it can remain as it is, then keep her single. It'll be easier on her. Same as what we've already seen. Notice the next two verses where he fleshes that out. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but has power over his own will, and is so determined in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. So then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. The message is plain, it is simple. They lived in a time of intense distress. They were under extreme pressure due to persecution and other matters. For that reason, Paul responded to their questions as he did. Social relations, when you become a Christian, do not change. He demonstrated that at least twice with two specific illustrations, the illustration of circumcision and that of slavery. Virginity is not per se preferable to marriage, but under the current circumstances, it would be better to stay in that way. Then he showed the shortness of life, perhaps to help them be able to endure the time that they would have to remain single when they perhaps really wanted to get married. Then he goes further, gives specific instructions that would let them know that it's better not to divide your attention, especially, again, in light of the present distress. And finally, he tells the father of virgin daughters, it's okay. It's okay to let them marry if that's what you choose to do. It's okay to keep them single if that's what you choose to do. But then Paul says the latter is better than the former because of the present distress.